I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
This opportunity to warmly congratulate you and the Bureau on your election. Please be assured of Sri Lanka's unconditional support. Madam Chair, the subject of terrorism is not new to any one of us. Terrorism undermines everything that we at the United Nations are trying to achieve. It is fundamentally conflicting in nature with the principles enshrined in the Charter of this Assembly. As such, Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned that despite the topic of terrorism being on the agenda of the UN for many long years, the collective response to terrorism is at most times hindered by our varied priorities. An important aspect would be to look forward on the draft Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. The inability to conclude negotiations for over a decade signals how divided we really are on this subject, and I'm fairly sure the terrorists love it. We must be able to put our differences aside and unite to defeat this global menace. Given the increasingly transnational and multifaceted nature of terrorism, it calls for a strong multilateral response with genuine collaboration among states with a unified voice. We must make it loud and clear that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations will not be tolerated. Sri Lanka is of the firm belief that the United Nations has and will continue to have an important role to play in coordinating an effective global response to terrorism. We support the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and acknowledge the important role that the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and other UN bodies play in counterterrorism efforts. I would urge the UN to unselectively draw on national experiences of member states to confront terrorism without reverting to the reprehensible alternative of seeking to penalize those states that have defeated terrorism. We can all learn from each other. As a country that has experienced terrorism for nearly 30 years, and as one of the very few countries that has actually defeated terrorism on our soil, Sri Lanka condemns unequivocally and in the strongest possible terms terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. All acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable regardless of their motivation. I wish to reiterate that terrorist acts are attacks on all of us, and it is high time for us to unite and act in solidarity to combat this menace. We cannot afford to be selective. We cannot afford to state that certain acts of terrorism are justifiable, and we certainly cannot afford to condemn some terrorists and turn a blind eye to others. Madam Chair, the terrorist organizations of today, its proponents no longer use the traditional brick and mortar ways to carry out their activities. They are far more sophisticated than you and I can ever dream of. Even the use of social media as a tool through which terrorist organizations spread their fundamentalist ideology and recruit and indoctrinate our youth is now something that we are all familiar with. For most countries that have grappled with terrorism, attacks against soft targets by terrorists are not new. International networks with linkages to organized crime continue to remain a critical lifeline for terrorist groups. However, we now witness a new dimension of these networks. These networks use people. They use educated people, people with impeccable backgrounds, and are bringing affluent people to propagate their ideologies, raise funds, and to achieve their ultimate objectives. The tools that are used by these networks to infiltrate our hearts are the very tools that we at the United Nations endeavor to promote and protect. Distinguished delegates, how do we then deal with these new developments? How do we deal with situations where hatred, racism, and other ideologies are being covertly propagated by these networks? Sharing of intelligence, databases, and expertise amongst members should take into consideration these developments, and we need to pool our resources that we can effectively counter this problem. Madam Chair, while the terror tactics of terrorist groups are brutal, in every way, we must ensure that our fight against terrorism does not embrace the lawless characteristics of these groups, and we must continue to foster and hold on to our common humanity. Sri Lanka, as a responsible member of the international community, remains committed to international cooperation to combat terrorism and look forward to dealing with this menace in a multifaceted way. The multifaceted nature of the strong points of terrorists in this brutal warfare, I say, calls for nothing less than a global-scale collaborative response that is stubbornly radical, yet humanely civil. Yes, they have all done, our predecessors have done some good work that has left our world a safer place to be in today. But we need a more direct strategy can endure for as long as the threat persists without hurting the sovereignty of nations and human rights of the same people it seeks to protect. We can gain a lot more striving for harmonious coexistence than we can by giving it to hate-filled rage and fear-driven ignorance. As terrorism is a global phenomenon, a major challenge facing policymakers is how to maximize international cooperation and support without unduly compromising national security, especially in instances where such activity is state-sponsored or countenanced. So, distinguished delegates, I hope these few points that I have placed before you would be food for thought in our fight against global terrorism. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. I now